Scholars built an entire calendar on sand, and nobody noticed for 13 centuries. Year you think it is might be wrong. Not by a few days, by centuries. In 1991, a German historian named Heribert Illig published a theory so audacious that it spent 3 decades quietly unraveling in academic margins. The early Middle Ages, roughly 614 to 911 CE, never actually happened. 300 years of European history, he argued, were fabricated wholesale into the historical record. Before we dismiss this as fringe nonsense, walk with me through the exhibit. The accepted timeline, the one in every textbook, rests on a foundation that looks rock solid from a distance. We have documents, we have architecture, we have coins and letters and official decrees. The Dark Ages happened, period. Except, and this is where it gets strange, the evidence itself is suspiciously thin. We have very few original documents from 614 to 911. What we do have are copies, made centuries later by monks working from copies of copies. The architectural record jumps. Archaeological layers don't align cleanly. It's as if someone drew a thick pencil line across 3 centuries and said, this happened, without showing the work. Illig noticed something else. The chronology of the early medieval papacy is a mess. Popes overlap. Reigns don't add up. The genealogies of Frankish kings contain gaps and contradictions that vanish the moment you remove those 3 centuries. It's like finding a family tree with phantom branches that, when pruned, suddenly make genealogical sense. The radiocarbon dating of artifacts from this period is inconsistent. Some objects supposedly from the 8th century date to the 11th. Others cluster oddly. When you compress the phantom centuries out of the timeline, the radiocarbon evidence realigns. Not perfectly, but far more neatly than it should. So the case for the phantom centuries seems plausible. Here's where we pause and turn the corner, because the mainstream historical consensus didn't dismiss Illig's work out of snobbery, they dismantled it, carefully, specifically. First problem. The archaeological record outside Western Europe doesn't support the phantom time theory at all. Byzantine coins, Islamic manuscripts, Chinese records, all of them place events in the 7th, 8th, and 9th centuries with independent, non-Western chronologies. If those 3 centuries didn't happen in Europe, they certainly happened everywhere else. The radiocarbon inconsistencies Illig cited. Closer inspection revealed they're largely artifacts of how radiocarbon calibration curves work, not evidence of missing centuries. Radiocarbon dating has a margin of error. When you account for that properly, the medieval dates hold up. The papal chronology problem, the overlaps and gaps, turns out to be less of a puzzle than Illig thought. Medieval record-keeping was genuinely chaotic, but not because centuries were invented. It was chaotic because the people doing the recording didn't have synchronized calendars, consistent naming conventions, or centralized archives. It's messy, but it's explicable. Here's the real story, and it's more interesting than a fabricated timeline. The Dark Ages weren't dark because nothing happened. They were dark because we lost the narrative thread. The Roman Empire collapsed. Writing became scarce. Institutional memory fragmented. We have fewer documents not because they were invented later, but because fewer people had the resources to write them down. What historians actually found, after 3 decades of testing Illig's hypothesis, is something subtler. The early medieval period is genuinely harder to date and sequence than the Roman period. But that's not because it was fabricated. It's because the documentary evidence is thinner, the chronological anchors fewer, and the regional variations starker. The phantom time hypothesis reveals something crucial about how we do history. We're not just reading the past. We're reconstructing it from fragments, and the fewer fragments you have, the more plausible alternative reconstructions become. Illig didn't prove the Dark Ages were invented. He proved that historical certainty is more fragile than we'd like to admit. Think about what this means. The Dark Ages happened. The evidence is real, though thinner than we'd prefer. But the very fact that a plausible case for their non-existence could be built means our historical timeline rests on interpretation, not certainty. We're reading between the lines of documents that weren't meant to be read as a continuous historical record. The implications ripple outward. If 3 centuries of European history could be plausibly questioned, what else in our timeline rests on shakier ground than we realize? Not fabrication, but gaps, reinterpretation, lost context. History isn't a series of facts. It's a narrative we build from incomplete evidence. This exhibit, this entire investigation, isn't about proving the Dark Ages didn't happen. It's about understanding how fragile historical knowledge actually is, and why. It's about recognizing that the scholars who rejected Illig's theory weren't protecting dogma. They were protecting rigor. And that rigor, when applied carefully, is what separates history from mythology. So no, the Dark Ages weren't fabricated. But the phantom time hypothesis did something valuable. It forced us to ask harder questions about how we know what we know. It exposed the assumptions baked into our timeline. And it reminded us that history, for all its apparent solidity, is always being revised by people willing to question the exhibit placard. Subscribe to uncover the forgotten stories history almost lost, ones that reshape how we understand the world.